Plainfield, Wisconsin, November 16th, 1957. Frank Worden is a deputy sheriff, and he's been trying to reach his mother all afternoon. She runs the hardware store in town, has run it for years. Basically the kind of place where everyone in Plainfield knows to come when they need something, where his mother or niece is almost always behind the counter. He's called, no answer. Stopped by once already and found it locked, which is unusual enough that he mentioned it to the sheriff. Now it's evening, maybe around 5 or 6 o'clock. Probably getting dark already because it's November in Wisconsin and the sun goes early. Frank has a key. He lets himself in. The store is empty. Register is open. Here's a chilling sign on the floor. Not a lot, maybe just a trace, but enough. Enough that Frank Worden stops moving and just stands there for a second, understanding something before he's ready to understand it. His mother is not here. The trace is going somewhere. He follows it. Out back in the shed attached to the store, he finds her. I'm not going to describe what he found in detail. What I will tell you is that Frank Worden, a deputy sheriff, a man who'd seen things in his line of work, walked out of that shed and had to be helped to a car. That's what this was. That's the scale of it. Within hours, investigators had a suspect, a local man, a farmer, someone the whole town knew, someone who'd been in this very store the day before, someone who neighbors would have described as odd but harmless, the kind of guy you didn't think much about. They drove to his farm. What they found there would change American culture forever and would start a conversation about evil that we're still having today. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a boy and his mother, alone on a farm outside Plainfield, with no one else in the world. Before we begin, you up? Good? Forget the noise outside for a second. Leave the cars, the sirens, and the stress at the door. Tonight, these stories will unfold slowly and respectfully, accompanied by gentle rain and subtle atmospheric visuals to create a calm space. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city you're in and what time it is there, and hit subscribe so we can stick together in the dark. We tell these dark stories not for entertainment or spectacle, and without any dramatization. We share them as a poignant reminder of the real people and real lives that were lost, and perhaps to help us recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, lower your volume just a bit, enough to let the rain gently carry you off to sleep. Lights off? Okay, good. Take a breath, a real one. Let's go back. Way back. Augusta Guine believed the world was going to hell. Not metaphorically, I mean she genuinely, literally believed that the world was full of sin and corruption, and that the only way to protect her family from it was to keep them away from it entirely. Away from other people, away from influences she couldn't control, away from the kind of normal childhood friendships and experiences that most kids take for granted. She was deeply religious, probably the kind of religious that becomes its own kind of cruelty, maybe without her ever realizing it. She told her sons, Ed, and his older brother Henry, that women were evil, that the outside world was contaminated, that salvation required isolation. She'd read them passages from the Old Testament, maybe the more severe and unforgiving ones specifically, probably convinced that the imagery of sin and punishment was exactly what two young boys needed to understand about the world they were living in. And she had the perfect tool for that isolation, a farm. Around 1914 or so, the Guine family moved from La Crosse, which Augusta called a sinkhole of filth. I mean, she had a way with words, to a 155-acre property just outside of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Remote, basically. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that nobody was stopping by casually. Nobody was dropping in unannounced. Nobody was influencing the boys in ways that Augusta hadn't approved. Ed left the farm to attend school. I think probably walked the distance every day. When outside of school, he was basically on the property full time, doing chores, listening to his mother, learning what she taught him about the world. H's father, George, was there too, but only technically. George Guine struggled with severe alcoholism and a destructive temper, casting a deep shadow over his sons. Probably made the house a frightening place in ways that were different from Augusta's particular brand of damage, but equally real. Ed later mentioned that the sheer stress of his father's volatile presence had a lasting physical impact on him. George cast a long shadow, basically. Even though Augusta was the dominant force in the household, the one whose voice really mattered, the one whose worldview took root in Ed's developing mind. George passed away in 1940, and by most accounts, Ed felt nothing much about it. His father was in absence even when he was present, probably just a source of pain that eventually stopped. And here's the thing about Ed's developing mind. It was absorbing all of this in ways that nobody around him could see. He was shy. His classmates remembered him as having strange mannerisms, a tendency toward seemingly random laughter, like he was responding to something only he could hear. He had a visual condition and a speech impediment that made him an easy target for bullies. He tried to make friends, probably, and Augusta punished him when he did, or so people close to the family later said. The message delivered over and over in whatever ways Augusta delivered messages was that other people were not safe. Other people were not to be trusted. The only person who understood Ed, who cared for Ed, who would ever really be there for Ed, was his mother. He believed her. He believed all of it. George Guine passed away in 1940. Medical complications. After years of alcoholism had done whatever it does to a person over time. Ed was 33 years old. He and Henry, his brother, were still on the farm, still unmarried, still living the life Augusta had constructed for them. After George's passing, they took on more odd jobs around the area to support the family, basically handyman work, helping neighbors with things they needed done. Henry is where the story gets murky for the first time, maybe where it starts to suggest something about Ed that hadn't fully surfaced yet. Henry Guine was 7 years older than Ed, and by some accounts he was not as completely absorbed in Augusta's worldview. He had concerns about her, maybe saw her more clearly than Ed did, probably expressed those concerns in front of his brother in ways that didn't sit well. He occasionally confronted Augusta, according to people who knew the family, suggested that her influence was not healthy. That's not a small thing to do in the Guine household, to push back against Augusta, to say out loud that something was wrong with how she operated. In 1944, the brothers were burning brush on the property when a fire got out of control. Henry was found to have passed away. Ed had reported him missing to police, and when officers arrived, Ed was able to lead them directly to where Henry was. Directly, without searching. There were unexplained marks on Henry. The loss was officially ruled an accident related to the fire. No extensive medical examinations were performed, and Ed, who had been able to go straight to his brother the moment police asked, was never seriously questioned about it. I don't know if Ed was directly responsible for Henry's fate. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. What I do know is that Henry was the one person in that household who questioned Augusta out loud, and that Henry passed away under circumstances nobody fully investigated, and that Ed knew exactly where he was. Those facts sit next to each other uncomfortably, and I'm not going to tell you they add up to certainty, because they don't. But I'm also not going to pretend the pattern isn't there. Augusta Guine passed away in 1945. She'd had a series of strokes, maybe related to severe hypertension, probably the kind of thing that accumulates over years in a person who carries the weight of the world as heavily as Augusta did. Ed was 39 years old. He had never left home, had never had a romantic relationship, had never built a life separate from his mother's orbit, and now she was gone, and he was alone in that farmhouse, and there was nobody left to be his whole world. He boarded up her room, left it exactly as it had been when she was alive, neat, immaculate, untouched, and then he let the rest of the house go to ruin, basically. The other rooms accumulated clutter and filth while Augusta's bedroom stayed perfect, a shrine to the person who had organized everything else around herself. What happened to Ed in the years after Augusta's passing is, psychologically, probably one of the more documented examples of what grief and isolation and a deeply disordered childhood can do when they combine in a single person. He became obsessed with physical structures, started reading medical texts, I think maybe textbooks he could get his hands on, probably anything that dealt with the biological structures in clinical detail. He became fascinated with extreme historical accounts, with complex and unusual medical procedures which were a topic of genuine scientific interest in that period, with anything involving the end of life, transformation, the boundary between one thing and another. He also started visiting the memorial grounds. There was a cemetery worker named Gus who befriended Ed around this time. Maybe they struck up a relationship through the odd jobs Ed was doing around Plainfield. Probably just two isolated men who found each other in a small town. Gus would tell Ed when recent services had concluded, when recent burials had taken place, and Ed would go back at night to trespass on those grounds. He claimed later that he made more than 40 visits to local cemeteries, that he took unthinkable things from those sites, that he used what he found to make deeply disturbing items, that he kept them at the farmhouse, accumulated them over years, incorporated them into the fabric of his daily life in ways that neighbors, if they'd ever really looked, would have found incomprehensible. But neighbors didn't really look, and when the occasional visitor came by and noticed something strange, an unusual bowl, an odd decoration, something that looked like it might have once been part of a person, Ed had a story ready. Wartime souvenirs from a cousin who'd served in the Pacific. Nothing to worry about. People believed him, basically, because he was Ed Guine, the odd handyman who'd lived on the farm his whole life, and babysat the neighbors' kids and helped out when people needed a hand. Because Plainfield was a small town where you thought you knew who people were. Because it was the 1950s in rural Wisconsin, and the framework for understanding what Ed was doing simply did not exist in most people's minds. He crossed the ultimate line for the first time, the first confirmed time. Anyway, in December 1954, Mary Hogan ran the local tavern. She was 51 years old, heavy-set, a private woman who kept to herself mostly. Probably the kind of person who knew everyone in town but wasn't close with many of them. She reminded Ed of his mother, according to what he said later. Something about her bearing, maybe, or her manner. He'd been a customer at her bar. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan disappeared. The scene at the tavern indicated a tragic encounter. Her car was still there. Nobody could explain what had happened. And Guyan, when people in town talked about it, apparently made jokes. Dark ones, odd ones, the kind of comments that people remembered later and couldn't quite explain why they'd let pass without pushing further. "She's not missing," he said once, something like that. I don't know the exact words. "She's out at my place." People thought he was being strange. They didn't think he was being literal. He was being literal. The tragic truth about Mary Hogan was uncovered at the farmhouse 3 years later, when investigators came for a different reason entirely. She'd been there the whole time, basically integrated into the collection that Ed had been building since Augusta passed away, since the nighttime disturbances started, since the world that Augusta had tried to protect him from proved impossible to block out, and the only response he could find was to try to bring the past back to life. He wasn't acting out of pure malice, exactly. Or at least that's not the most accurate way to frame it. He was trying to be his mother, to recreate her, to crawl back inside the only relationship that had ever felt real to him. And when the cemetery stopped being enough, when what he was bringing home wasn't sufficient, he crossed a final, tragic line. That's the part that sits with you, I think. Not the horror movie version of Ed Gein, not the infamous movie antagonist or the well-known cinematic figure mythology that came later. The actual Ed Gein, a lonely, damaged, profoundly broken man who'd been shaped into something unrecognizable by a woman who thought she was protecting him. The farm outside Plainfield was dark and quiet in those years. Nobody checked. Nobody came. And in that quiet, Ed was building something, or trying to build something. Maybe more accurately trying to rebuild something that was already gone. The woman who had been his entire world. The only person who had ever made sense to him. He was trying to get her back, basically, and the only way his broken psychology knew how to try. 3 years after Mary Hogan disappeared, Ed Gein would finally be seen for what he was. Not because anyone had been looking hard enough, but because he made a mistake, finally, after years of nobody looking at all. After years of a small town in Wisconsin deciding, without really deciding, that the odd man on the farm outside of town was just odd and not something more than that. Plainfield trusted Ed Gein. He babysat their children, helped with their errands, fixed things when things needed fixing. The town thought it knew him. It didn't know him at all. November 16th, 1957, a Saturday morning. Bernice Worden was 58 years old. She ran the hardware store in Plainfield that had belonged to her late husband, basically a fixture of the town, the kind of business where 3 generations of the same families had been coming in since before anyone could remember. She opened the store every morning, kept the register, helped whoever needed help finding what they needed. She was a widow. She had a son, Frank, who was a deputy with the county sheriff's office. That Saturday morning, Bernice had opened the store as usual. The last entry in her sales receipt book was for a half-gallon of antifreeze, sold that morning to Ed Gein, who'd been in earlier and told her he'd be back. By afternoon, Frank Worden couldn't reach her. The store was locked, which it shouldn't have been. The register was open, and there was a chilling sign, not a lot but a trace going toward the back. You already know what Frank found in the shed. I told you that in the opening. I'm not going to describe it again because once is enough, and maybe once was already more than necessary. What I want to talk about is what happened next, what investigators found when they drove out to the Gein farm that evening, after Frank had been helped to a car, after the sheriff had been called, after somebody had looked at the chilling scene and the open register and the antifreeze receipt and connected the obvious dots to the odd man who lived on the property a few miles outside of town. After Frank had been helped to a car, after the sheriff had been called, after somebody had looked at the chilling scene and the open register and the antifreeze receipt and connected the obvious dots to the odd man who lived on the property a few miles outside of town. They found Ed at a neighbor's house, actually. He'd been there for dinner, maybe, or just visiting. I'm not entirely sure of the details. Probably something mundane. Basically Ed Gein, doing the normal-seeming thing he always did. He was brought in for questioning, and investigators went to the farm. I want to be careful here about how much detail I go into, because there's a version of this story that wallows in the specifics in a way I don't think serves anyone, and there's a version that gives you enough to understand what was found without turning it into something exploitative. I'm going to try to do the second version. What investigators found at the Gein farmhouse was, by every account from everyone who was there, something they were not prepared for. Not just the physical evidence of what he'd done, but the scale of it, the years of accumulation, the way the ordinary and the horrific existed side by side in every room. There were tragic discoveries. There were items made from the unthinkable. There were things that investigators described later in interviews and in court documents, using language that suggested they were struggling to find words adequate to what they were looking at. Evidence connected to multiple past incidents by later forensic estimates, some from graves, some not. Augusta's room was immaculate. Every other part of the house was chaos. But her room, the room he'd sealed off when she passed away and never disturbed, was exactly as it had been when she was alive, clean, ordered, preserved. That detail, I think, tells you more about Ed Gein than anything else in the case. Passed away, he kept one space sacred. He kept her. That's what all of it was. Probably a failed attempt to keep her. The town of Plainfield was, by most accounts, completely blindsided. Ed Gein had babysat people's children. He'd helped with errands. He'd fixed things when things needed fixing, showed up when he was called, accepted dinner invitations, and made conversation, and done the things that a neighbor does. He was the guy you called when you needed a hand. The guy who showed up and asked how you were doing and seemed to mean it, more or less. And now there was a story on the front page of every newspaper in the country about what was in his farmhouse, and the people of Plainfield had to figure out how to absorb the fact that they'd trusted him. The guy who showed up and asked how you were doing and seemed to mean it, more or less. And now there was a story on the front page of every newspaper in the country about what was in his farmhouse, and the people of Plainfield had to figure out how to absorb the fact that they'd trusted him. Reporters descended on the town. Photographers, journalists from papers across the country, basically a media circus in the middle of a quiet Wisconsin winter that the people of Plainfield were completely unprepared for and deeply unhappy about. The town became, overnight, the place where Ed Gein had lived, and that was a thing it would never fully stop being. Even now, decades later, Plainfield is known primarily for this, for the farmhouse, for the shed, for the man who'd been their neighbor. I don't know how you do that, honestly. How you recalibrate everything you thought you understood about a person you'd known for decades. The parents who'd left their kids with him. The neighbors who'd had him to dinner. The people who'd thought his dark jokes were just eccentric humor, and there had been jokes, apparently dark ones, comments about Mary Hogan, that people had filed away as strange without pushing further. They all had to sit with the knowledge that they'd been in the same rooms as whatever Ed Gein was, and hadn't seen it. Maybe there was nothing to see in the end. Maybe the kind of thing Ed Gein was doing doesn't show up on the surface in ways that normal people are equipped to detect. Or maybe there were signs that people brushed off because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. Probably both, I think. Probably a complicated mix of genuine concealment and collective willingness to not look too closely. The farmhouse burned down in March 1958, about 4 months after the arrest. Nobody ever officially determined the cause. Ed, when he was told about it, shrugged and said just as well. The property was sold eventually, bought by real estate dealers for a forest planting plot. Nothing was ever built on it. The legal proceedings were complicated and slow, the way they always are when someone is clearly not operating within the normal range of human psychology, and the system has to figure out what to do with that. Ed was initially found unfit to stand trial in January 1958, based on a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for Specialized Institutional Care in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he spent the next decade working as a carpenter's assistant, a mason's helper, a medical center aide. By all accounts, he was cooperative and mild-mannered in the institution, basically the same person the neighbors in Plainfield had described, just now in a controlled environment where the things he was doing when nobody was looking couldn't happen anymore. In 1968, 10 years after his arrest, psychiatrists determined that Ed Gein was competent to stand trial. He went to court, was tried for the tragic fate of Bernice Worden, and was held fully accountable, and then, in the penalty phase, was found not guilty due to his profound psychological state. Remanded back to the psychiatric institution, never sentenced to prison in the conventional sense. He spent the rest of his life in institutional care, the Central State Hospital, then the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison. Quiet, cooperative, reportedly quite pleasant to the staff, the same Ed that Plainfield had known, basically just in a context where the things he'd been doing in the dark couldn't happen. He worked jobs in the institution, made things with his hands, by all accounts was not a difficult patient. Whatever the monster was that had built itself in that farmhouse, it seemed to require a specific set of conditions that the institution didn't provide. He passed away on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure related to lung cancer. He was 77 years old. He'd spent 27 years in institutional care. He outlived most of the people in Plainfield who'd known him as a neighbor, probably outlived some of the investigators who'd searched his farm, maybe outlived people who'd thought about him every day since 1957. He's buried in Plainfield Cemetery between his parents and his brother. His grave marker was stolen by souvenir hunters at some point, chipped away over the years until the stone itself disappeared in 2000, recovered later near Seattle and placed in storage. The grave is now unmarked, which is maybe fitting or maybe not fitting at all. I honestly don't know. He got to live out his days to old age in a warm bed while Bernice Worden's son, Frank, lived with November 16, 1957 for the rest of his life. There's one more thing I want to say before we move on, because I think it's the part that gets lost in all the mythology that built up around Ed Gein over the decades. The movies came, classic 1960s psychological thrillers first, in 1960, which didn't really use Gein's story directly, but drew on the mother obsession and the rural isolation and the psychological architecture of what he was. Then iconic 1970s rural horror films, then Silence of the Lambs, then dozens of others in various forms, each taking some piece of the Gein mythology and amplifying it for entertainment. Buffalo Bill, Leatherface, Norman Bates, characters that became iconic, that shaped how generations of people think about what a monster looks like. And in the process, the actual Ed Gein, the specific real person who had grown up on that farm outside Plainfield, who had been shaped into something unrecognizable by a mother who thought she was protecting him, who had spent his adult life alone and grieving in a way that expressed itself in the most horrific possible way, got swallowed by the myth. I'm not asking you to feel sympathy for Ed Gein. I'm not sure sympathy is the right response, or even a response that makes sense in this context. What I'm saying is that the myth made him into a monster, and monsters are easier to look at than damaged people, and maybe that's why the myth was so appealing. A monster is other. A monster is not something you have to worry about understanding. A monster is not something you have to worry about understanding. A damaged person, shaped by the specific damage of a specific childhood, is something else, is something closer, is something that asks harder questions about what we build in children when we decide to cut them off from everything, when we make ourselves their whole world, when we teach them that love and fear are the same thing. Augusta thought she was protecting Ed. She was making him into something that couldn't be protected from. The farm is gone, the house burned. The grave is unmarked, but the questions are still there, probably for anyone willing to sit with them. Ed Gein didn't become famous until after he was caught, obviously, but the fame that came was something nobody in Plainfield had anticipated, and probably nobody was prepared for. Reporters showed up within days, photographers, news crews from cities that had never heard of Plainfield, Wisconsin before November 16, 1957, and now suddenly needed to put it on a map. The town became a destination, basically, for the kind of people who drive to disaster sites and stand outside the tape and try to understand something about the world by being physically proximate to where something terrible happened. The hardware store, the farm, the road between them. People came to look at all of it, maybe trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense, probably just drawn by the same morbid gravity that pulls people toward the inexplicable. And then the film started. Robert Bloch published a novel called Psycho in 1959, just 2 years after Guy's arrest. He'd been living in Wisconsin at the time, had read about the case in the newspapers, and wrote a book that drew on the general psychological architecture of what Guy was, the isolation, the domineering mother, the twisted relationship between a man and the woman who defined everything for him. Norman Bates isn't Ed Gein. The specific incidents are different, the specific circumstances are different. But the emotional template, a man who can't let his mother go, who has built his entire interior life around her, who causes profound tragedies in ways connected to that obsession, came from Guy. Alfred Hitchcock turned it into one of the most influential films in American history. Then, in 1974, a deeply unsettling rural horror film redefined the genre. Leatherface wears a chilling cinematic disguise, that's Guy. The isolated rural setting, the family that's completely cut off from normal society, the horror that lives behind a door, in a house that looks ordinary from the outside, all of it reaching back to what was found on that farm outside Plainfield. The film's director, Tobe Hooper, was partly drawing on news coverage of Guy's case from years earlier, probably on the specific images of the farmhouse that had circulated in newspapers and magazines. He turned it into something that terrified a generation of moviegoers and spawned decades of sequels and remakes. Then Silence of the Lambs in 1991, Buffalo Bill, whose unthinkable obsession led to tragic outcomes, who wants to literally transform himself through them. That's Guy too, or the most extreme amplification of Guy anyway. The version that takes one specific detail from the farmhouse and builds an entire character around it. The unimaginable creations that investigators found at the Guy property. I described them in the last section without going into detail, and I'm going to keep it that way, became the central horror of Buffalo Bill, translated into a different context, but unmistakably drawn from the same source. 3 of the most iconic horror villains in American cinema, all drawing from the same source. The same farmhouse, the same broken man, the same Augusta, though Augusta herself is rarely the center of the story in any of these adaptations. She's the absence that explains everything, and somehow that's almost more disturbing than making her a character. I want to go back to Ed and the institution for a moment, because I think the institutional years get skipped past in most tellings of this story, and they matter. He spent 27 years at the Central State Hospital, and then Mendota. That's longer than most people spend at any job, longer than many marriages, longer than some entire adult lives. He arrived in 1958 at 51 years old, and he passed away there in 1984 at 77. The majority of his adult life after Augusta was in institutional care. And by all accounts, and I want to be careful here, because I'm aware of how this sounds, he was fine. He was cooperative. He followed the rules. He worked jobs within the institution: carpenter's assistant, mason's helper, aide in the medical center, basically contributed to the functioning of the place in whatever way he was asked to. Staff described him as pleasant. Some found him likable, apparently, which is a genuinely strange sentence to write, but seems to be accurate. There's a version of this that makes psychological sense, I think, even if it doesn't make moral sense. The farmhouse had been a place with no structure, no oversight, no external framework, just Ed alone with his obsession and no one to interrupt it. The institution provided exactly what the farmhouse hadn't: routine, supervision, purpose, contact with other people. Whatever it was that Ed became in those years of isolation, whatever the farmhouse version of him was, didn't have the conditions it needed to operate in a locked ward in Madison, Wisconsin. He'd passed away in a bed of a severe illness related to smoking, probably health complications. He was returned to Plainfield and buried in the family plot between his parents and his brother Henry. The grave had a marker for years, until souvenir hunters started chipping pieces off it, until eventually the stone was taken entirely, stolen in 2000 and recovered near Seattle and placed in storage. His grave is now unmarked. I keep thinking about that, about the fact that someone drove from Wisconsin to Seattle with memorial marker. I mean, physically loaded it into a vehicle and transported it across several states, presumably because they thought it was worth having. What do you do with Ed Gein's gravestone? What does it mean to want to own that? I don't know. People are drawn to darkness in ways I don't always understand, and probably can't fully explain. Plainfield recovered, or tried to. Small towns do that. They absorb the thing that happened and keep going, because what else is there to do? The hardware store eventually had different owners. The property where the farmhouse had been was turned over and replanted. Life went on the way life does. But the town never fully escaped the association. Probably never will. If you know one fact about Plainfield, Wisconsin, it's probably the Ed Gein fact, and that's likely to remain true indefinitely. Some places become permanently attached to the worst thing that happened there, and Plainfield is one of them. I've thought about what it means to live your whole life in a place that's defined, for everyone outside it, by this one event. The people who went to school with Ed Gein's neighbors' kids. The families who'd been in the hardware store 100 times and now had to figure out how to feel about that. The next generation, and the one after that, who grew up knowing what the town was known for and having to decide what to do with that knowledge. And Bernice Worden's family. Frank, specifically, who found her, who had to live the rest of his life with what he found in that shed, who was a deputy sheriff doing his job, and then suddenly he was something else, someone who carried November 16th, 1957 inside him in ways that never go away. I don't know what happened to Frank Worden after that day. The record doesn't give you much. But I think about him sometimes when I think about this case. The son who couldn't reach his mother on a Saturday afternoon and went to check. There's something to be said for the people who stayed in Plainfield, who didn't let the association drive them out, who built their lives there and raised their kids there, and maybe became, over time, a little protective of the place. who knew it as more than what Ed Gein had turned it into for the rest of the world. I said something at the end of the last section that I want to come back to, about the difference between the monster mythology and the actual person. The mythology is comfortable. Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, they're scary in ways that feel contained. They're on a screen. They're in a story. The horror has edges and a runtime, and you can turn it off or close the book when it gets to be too much. The monster version of Ed Gein is terrifying and fascinating, and has generated decades of entertainment and cultural conversation, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. But the actual Ed Gein was not a monster in the way those characters are monsters. He was a person who had been shaped from the earliest age into something that couldn't function outside the particular world Augusta had built for him. He was a person who had never had a real relationship with anyone except his mother, who had never left home, never built anything independent, never been allowed to develop the parts of himself that might have had some connection to the normal range of Heliance. And then Augusta passed away, and he was alone with that, and the results were horrific. I'm not asking you to mourn Ed Gein. I'm not sure mourning is the right framework at all. What I'm saying is that when we turn him into a monster, we lose the more disturbing question, which is what Augusta did, and why she was allowed to do it. And how many children across how many generations have been shaped by similar dynamics in ways that didn't produce, Ed Gein specifically, but produced damage of their own, damage that was real and serious and invisible to anyone looking from outside. Augusta thought she was raising good sons. She thought she was protecting them from a world full of sin. She thought she was doing right by her children. She made Ed Gein. That's the question that doesn't go away when you spend time with this case. Not what was in the farmhouse, but what was in the house before that, in the years when Augusta was alive and reading scripture and telling two boys that the world was unsafe, and they were lucky to have her to keep them safe from it. That's where it started. That's where it always starts. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable thing this case leaves behind. Not the farmhouse, not the films, not the unmarked grave in Plainfield Cemetery, but the question of how many Augustas there are. How many children right now are being raised in isolation, taught that the world is dangerous and that the only safe place is inside a single relationship, learning to collapse their entire interior life around one person. Most of them won't become Ed Gein, but all of them will carry the damage. All of them will pay some version of the cost. I keep thinking about the room. Augusta's room, the one Ed sealed off and never touched, the one that was immaculate while everything else in the house fell apart around it, dishes piling up, floors going unswept, the whole place becoming this accumulation of years without anyone caring for it. But her room stayed perfect. Her room stayed exactly the way she'd left it. That's the image I can't get out of my head from this case. Not the farmhouse, not the shed, not the things investigators found. Just a man alone in a house that's slowly deteriorating, keeping one room perfect for a woman who has been gone for years, thinking that's the same as keeping her. It's not a horror movie image, that one. It's just sad. Profoundly, quietly, completely sad. Anyway, it's raining now, probably one of those nights where the rain comes in sideways a little, or maybe it's gentle. I don't know where you are. I don't know what your night looks like, but you've been here for a while now, listening, and I hope that means whatever you needed, tonight you found some version of it. Bernice Worden deserves to be remembered. Mary Hogan deserves to be remembered. The hardware store on Main Street in Plainfield, the one Frank couldn't reach his mother at that Saturday afternoon, that's where this ends, really. Not with Ed, with them. If you're still here, drop a key emoji in the comments. And if these stories are where you come when the dark gets loud, hit subscribe. There are more. The rain keeps falling. Rest now.